Well, again, want to welcome you to Valley Grace. For those of you who are here in person, and we've had a chance to kind of reconnect, a few more are coming back in, and that's always great. So as a result of that, we'll blame it on this. The time that we had to interact, we started a few minutes late, but that's okay. You know, it's really great to be able to connect in person. For those of you who are watching online, whether it's right now or a little bit later and aren't able to do that, don't feel that this is where you ought to be right now. Again, we're grateful that you're choosing to join in with us, those of you who are part of Valley Grace family. And maybe there are some of you who are kind of checking Valley Grace out. Great that you are doing that. If we can be of any help to you in your spiritual journey, or if there's a need that you have that you think we might be able to come alongside of you, we just want you to know we're here to help. And so welcome to you as well. There's an African proverb that says, the ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people. I am told, and I know Confucius gets blamed for a lot of things, but I am told that Confucius came up with one of his teachings, the strength of a nation is derived from the integrity of its homes. And then Mr. Anonymous, or Mrs. Anonymous, I'm not sure who wrote this, but it is a telling piece. The life and the future of the nation depends on the character of the home, and the character of the home depends on the spiritual life of the parents. That's a truism, and that is something that is absolutely critical for us as we look around us and as we look at the state of our nation and we grieve and we ask, what has gone wrong? What has brought this about? Why are we in this particular situation? And one of the significant answers to that question is because there's been the breakdown of the home. There's been a failure to teach and to model God's principles to the next generation. And so there's this important aspect that we have, those of you who are parents, those of you who are thinking at some point in time that you want to become you want to get married, or you want to have a family, you want to go down that path. It is important for us to understand that there is a spiritual dimension that forms the foundation of your home. I don't mean merely religious. There's a term that's often thrown out, the idea about, I may not be spiritual, but at least I'm religious. Well, religious isn't very helpful, as we will see in the context of the story in 1 Samuel as we work our way through this passage. We're going to see that that Eli was religious, his kids were religious, but it was an ungodly home. And so there is a significant difference between being followers of Christ and being spiritual or being religious. And so we never underestimate the power of a Christian home, the ability to change the environment around you, to change a school, to change a community, to change a church based upon the home. This morning we're going to be reminded of foundational principles for your home. Actually, there are 4 of them that we will look at in just a moment. And I realize that these are effective and work for providing a stable home environment. And I realize that in those here this morning are listening even many different stages of life. Some of you are in middle school, and some of you are in high school. Some of you are college or graduates. You're working singles. Others of you are recently married, but without children, or maybe expecting children. A number of you are married with children. Others are empty nesters. Others are grandparents or retired, or some of you have been through the pain of divorce. And I trust that yet as we open up the scriptures, as we open up the Bible, it's an encouragement to us to consider how we live our lives before God, no matter where we find ourselves in that particular environment. And so just because you don't yet have a family or you aren't yet married, please don't tune this out. This will be important for you. Before jumping into the text, we need to kind of back up just for a moment into what we looked at last week to set the context for what's taking place. In case you haven't had a chance to read through 1 Samuel, the first verses there. Last week we were introduced to three persons, three individuals in the book of Samuel. One was Elkanah. He's a husband. He's a dad. He's just referred to as a certain man. There really is not a lot that sticks out in his life that we would hold him in high esteem. Those who lived during his time would say that he was in high esteem. He's just the average individual. He's just a certain man. And apparently Elkanah found a woman that he loved. Her name was Hannah, and so he marries Hannah. And after a number of years, she continues to not be able to produce children, to have a child. And so as a result of that, Elkanah thinks he needs to help out God. In that day and in that context, having a child, particularly a son, was important in order to pass on the family name, in order to pass on the inheritance that was there, in order to live that out. And so this aspect of not having a son was an important piece of that culture. And so because Hannah was not able to have a son, apparently, again, as Elkanah decides that I need to help God, he marries another woman by the name of Peninnah, and she is able to have children. Again, this is not God's stamp of approval on multiple wives, on polygamy of any kind of sort. It was the fact that here's somebody who violated God's principles, and as a result of that, there's tension with the home, which will always be the case. Whenever we violate God's principles for life, for home, for marriage, there's going to be tension. And so that begins to take place, and it becomes particularly evident when Elkanah would take Hannah and Peninnah and her kids, and they would go to Shiloh, because once a year they were instructed that they were to go and worship God, though they certainly worship God at home. But this was a significant trek. It was just going to that place where God's presence was, not in a special way, was determined. God obviously is present everywhere. But every year when they would go up, Peninnah would start to agitate. I find that fascinating, that in this time when your heart is supposed to be right with God, what's she doing? Is she's agitating with Hannah. And if you remember in the verses that we read, they're very descriptive. And so we had words like her rival, Hannah's rival, who was Peninnah, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her. She would provoke her in verse 7. In verse 10, Hannah was greatly distressed, and she wept bitterly. Verse 11, down to verse 15. And she says before God in her prayer, I'm a woman who's oppressed by God and spirit. And so she understood that there were difficulties, there was hardships, and it came about in this time of worship in a very special way. And so she goes before the Lord and she prays to the Lord. She asks God specifically to give her a son. And then in verse 18, it doesn't tell us that God promised to do anything, but there were two things that we took out of this in regards to prayer. And number one was that our time spent with God, even if He doesn't change our circumstances, is not wasted. The time that you spend with God in communication and interaction is never wasted. But secondly, oftentimes prayer does change things. It may not be the specific environment and situation. It might be the fact that it changes us. And that's often what happens. And yet in this particular situation, God determines that He is going to answer Hannah's prayer because she prayed, and He's going to change that situation. And so we pick up the story then and invite you to grab a Bible if you haven't found your place there in one yet. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 19 through 28 will be our focus this morning. And I want us to see four foundational principles for your home. These are what we see in the life of Elkanah and Hannah in their life together. And the first foundational principle we find in verses 19 to 20. And that is to understand that children are a gift from the Lord. That God's gift to you are kids, or God's gift to you are children. There are no accidents. There may be some who are unplanned, but there are no accidents. And so we read in verse 19, then they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. They're still in Shiloh in verse 19, and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with his wife and knew her. I like the King James because it's a whole lot more than just physical intimacy. There's this relationship and knowledge that comes in a physical union between a husband and a wife. They had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. The Lord remembered her. Isn't that a fascinating phrase? Please understand, whenever you find that phrase, it doesn't mean that somehow God was too busy doing something else. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember. Yeah, I got something over here in my to-do list that I forgot to do. Whenever you find that phrase, the Lord remembered, it means God is getting ready to take action as a result of something, most often as a result of prayer, as a result of His people doing something. And so when God remembers, He's getting ready to take action. And so God answers her prayer. She's been barren and she's been provoked and she's prayed, and now God answers her prayer. And then in verse 20, it came about in due time after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I've asked him of the Lord. She recognized that God had answered her prayer. The word Samuel, the name Samuel, there's some different understandings, but the best one is the fact that God hears. And every time she calls his name, and every time Elkanah calls Samuel's name, it's a reminder that God hears. God has heard my prayer. This is an answer to my prayer. You ever stop to think about, as you're kind of reflecting on this, that oftentimes God uses difficulties to accomplish things in our lives that perhaps He would not have done without the difficulty? Think about it for a moment. In Hannah's situation, if there had been no barrenness, and you remember, we're told in the text that God is the one who closed her womb. If there had been no barrenness, there'd be no ridicule. If there had been no ridicule, there probably would not have been any prayer for this specific item. And if there had not been any prayer, there'd be no Samuel. And if there was no Samuel, there would be no change in the heart of Israel in a preparation for a king. And as we look back at our own lives, some of the difficulties and hardships that we've gone through, we begin to see that, God can use those if we focus and don't run from Him and say, well, if that's the way you're going to treat me. Hardships in your home. Maybe there are tensions in the marriage. All right, now we've got some things we need to fix. We've got some things we don't want to continue to live this way. It might be a job situation, a job that you specifically prayed for and you'd worked with, and maybe you've been laid off because of this virus, or maybe you lost your job. And yet it's through that job loss that God opens up another door, another opportunity. Been interesting, again, just being able to walk through a number of situations with people within our own church family. A job loss, wasn't ready to quit, wasn't ready to be done, but because of that job loss was able to invest in the life of some grandkids because there was time to do that. It's not the way you would have written the story, and yet you see the investment of a godly grandparent into the lives of grandkids. Maybe it's health. Some twists and turns through the health aspect of your life. Maybe it's schooling. You had your heart set on going to a particular college or university or a tech school, and you didn't get in. And you look at that and you begin to realize maybe God's doing something different. The direction of my life was changed when I didn't get into the number one school of my choice after high school. I thought I had it figured out. But as I've talked to individuals within that particular profession, it was, it's a good, honest profession. I probably wasn't cut out for that. All right, I wasn't. God knew it, all right? So I'm just hedging it a little because I thought I had a good plan. Dating relationship. that goes sour, that goes south, that breaks up. And there's the trauma, the up and down of the dating relationship. And you've probably seen it too. And, there's the note on the car of your child that says, I'm not sure this is working. And so get off of work and read that and comes home crying. And then a couple weeks later, another note on the car saying, well, I think I want to try this again. And then there's a euphoria in the household. And then a few weeks later, we're done for good. And only to find out that, that individual seemed to go off the rails. I don't know where they are now in their life. Hopefully they've come back to Christ. But God spared a lot of heartache and grief. I think there was an individual who made this statement. Billy Graham's wife, she said, I'm so glad God didn't answer my prayer when it came to dating, because I would have married the wrong guy 3 times. And so it's through these hardships, are we willing to pull back? Whatever that difficulty, and maybe sometimes even the homeschooling deal. Are we willing to pull back and say, okay, God, what are the benefits that you want to do? What do you want to teach me from this situation? And so the first foundational principle is that children are God's gift to you. They're not accidents, they're not by chance, they're God's gift. And we find that through much of the scriptures. The second foundational principle is the fact of establishing a God-centered home. A God-centered home. We pick that up in verses 21 through 23. Then the man Elkanah went up with all of his household to offer to the Lord yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. It wasn't just that Elkanah thought, it wasn't a once a year kind of thing. He was living out a God-centered home back home in Ramah. We would use the term today a Jesus-centered home or a Christ-centered home. And so he would go up yearly, as was required of those who wanted to demonstrate their worship before God. But it wasn't just that event. It was carrying on something that was done at home. In verse 22, but Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I'll bring him, and that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Elkanah and Hannah were modeling what it means to live out a God-centered home. They were committed to worshiping God, making that a priority in their lives. This wasn't a Christmas and Easter kind of family. They were consistent. And as we'll see even in the life of Samuel, that there were things that he learned at home, even though it was probably for only 3 short years. Because most often in that day, women would wean a child at 2 to 3 years of age. And so that was the promise that Hannah had made before God, that I want to be able to wean him, and then I'll give him into God's service. So what are the motives of worshiping God? It's not because God is narcissistic, that somehow we have to come on Sunday to tell God how good he is so that things go well on Monday through Saturday. It's the fact that we owe our very life to God. We reorient ourselves as we sing about who he is and what he's done in our world and how he continues to work in our world. We sang it, that God can take the bad things and work it for our good. We may not see it in the few weeks or months or perhaps even years. And yet as we look at it, we realize that is absolutely true. The most important lesson that you as parents can teach your children is to teach and to show them how to follow Jesus. What does it look like to follow Jesus in our home? What does it look like to follow Jesus as in our parenting process? What does it look like to follow Jesus at work? What does it look like to follow Jesus as we're out and about? What difference does he make in our lives and how we interact with one another? And so what we see is that there is a spiritual unity between Elkanah and Hannah. I have no idea, regarding Peninnah. She really doesn't come back into play very big in this story. But here were two individuals, Elkanah and Hannah, who were united spiritually as a husband and as a wife. That is why it is so important for those of you who are looking for a marriage partner at some point in time, that the piece that needs to be at the top is, are they a follower of Jesus? Is she a follower of Jesus? Is he an active follower of Jesus? Not someone who claims to be a follower of Jesus. Not someone who says, hey, if we get married or if we at least get connected, I'll come to church a few times. Now, God sometimes works behind the scenes and brings someone who doesn't know Jesus to Jesus in a marriage relationship, and that's exciting, but don't count on it. And so what we find is that spiritual unity is so important. The joint parenting methods then come out of that. How are we going to parent our children? It's interesting, being able to sit down, love it, being able to sit down with individuals who say, hey, we're talking about getting married. We'd like to get married. And would you do that? And I'd be happy to do that. And, what are requirements? Well, we'll spend some time together in doing some homework. And you get to do it at home. We'll come back in and we'll go over this. And again, it's not going to answer all your questions, but at least it raises some questions. And one of the ones that they haven't really thought, most of them haven't, some of them have, thought about is, how are you going to parent your child? Someone comes from a very lenient home and, they just spoke to, the child, and the child broke down in tears. That's how we're going to do it. And someone else comes from another home in which they were spoken to, and in fact, there was some form of discipline that was exercised. That didn't hurt. So what are you going to do when you find those kids? What's the model? How are you going to work together? What's the principles for parenting? Discipline. And discipline isn't always negative. It also has a positive idea. Walk in this way. So this area of discipline, the area of parenting, what's your source of truth? What are you going to use as the manual to raise your kids? Back in the 50-ish, from what I was told, Dr. Spock and his baby book was kind of the big one back then. And I've had conversations with parents who are raising kids. Part of what he was saying is, never be negative to your kids. If they throw a rock through the window, tell them what a great arm. Never say no. It's not what the Bible tells us. It tells us that all of us are born with this propensity toward evil, and it needs to be driven far from us. I heard somebody just tell me recently, if you're the one who told me, I apologize. I don't remember the details specifically or if I read it. But it was someone who was getting ready, had the opportunity to be a nanny in the West Coast sometime fairly recently. And in order to go to be this nanny, there were 3 other nannies who were going to be there, apparently very wealthy home, and it would be a place to live, and a car would be provided, and all of these things, and a decent salary. But there was at least just one requirement at the very top of the list, and that is, you can never tell our kids no. Maybe we're starting to reap some of the consequences of Dr. Spock and that whole thing. Which proves to us, does it not, that is erroneous and false teaching. So where are we going to go for the source of our truth? What has stood the tests of time? Dear friends, it's this book. People change, but the principles still remain the same. Well, I don't know if I really believe in it. I've got a different way. Well, we've watched that down through time. And so there's this aspect of the source of truth. And I am just absolutely thrilled when I hear moms and dads, whether single parent or whether they're married individuals, talking about what they're trying to do at home to inculcate God's truth into the lives of their kids. You may not get it every single day, but the general tendency is we're having some family devotions, and it might be short because the kids are younger, and then as they get older, a little bit more into, and I'm not talking about doing an hour-and-a-half sermon, but a little bit more into what does it mean to walk with God. Let's open it up. Let's see the principles that apply to life. Let's pray. Let's talk to God about these areas of life. And I get so encouraged as I hear, I don't come to say, look what we're doing. It's just to hear what God is doing in the lives of those who are taking it seriously. So foundation principle number 2. Foundation principle number 3, we find it here, is the aspect of keeping vows and keeping promises. Back in verse 11, we read that Hannah had made this vow that after my son is weaned, Lord, if you give me a son after he is weaned, I'm going to give him back to you. And then we see in verse 21 where Elkanah himself says, I'm going to pay my vow. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 give a broad statement and says, in essence, don't make a vow before God that you don't plan to keep. Because why would you want God to be angry with you? And why would you want him to destroy the works of your hands? In other words, God takes our vows and our promises very, very seriously. For most of us, it probably centers around 2 main areas. One would be our marriage vows, and the other would be our parent-child dedication vows that we do. And when we make those vows, most of us don't have a clue. When we're standing up front making those vows, and we want them to be true, but for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, unto death do us part, so help me God. Those are pretty significant. And when we say those vows, we are making those vows before God. Now, yes, we often have individuals who come, and we refer to them as the audience and the invited guests. And the reason really behind why you invite them is not so that you get more presents at your wedding ceremony. The reason is really so that they might be witnesses to what you are saying before God, that you are making sacred commitment and promises before God. I realize those of you who are in the younger set are being prompted and challenged that vows and marriage is just a piece of paper, and you don't need that to make a marriage work or to make a relationship work. You see that on television. You are bombarded with that at school. That's pretty much what is out there. But I want to challenge your thinking in regards to that. What's the purpose of marriage, and what's the purpose of vows? You see, marriage vows force us to think about values and what's important to us. It isn't just a matter we're going to live under the same roof. Though sometimes, unfortunately, those who have made marriage commitments, that's kind of 2 ships passing in the night, and that's all it is. But marriage vows make us stop and think, what is it that I'm committing to? What's important? How do we plan to treat each other? When the finances get tight, am I bailing out? When there's a little more sickness than what I signed up for, am I bailing out? Are these vows that I'm making for as long as you make me happy? We'll be committed together? Or as long as we both shall love? I've heard that actually I have not used that one. Will not use that one, but I've heard about that one. We are committing ourselves together as long as we both shall love. Or is it as long as I don't find someone else I like better, who treats me kinder? Jesus went on to make the statement that divorce is caused by the hardness of heart, and all of us have that hardness of heart in us. And by the way, for those of you, I know that there's some within our own church family, and there are some who are probably watching online who have been through the pain and trauma of divorce, and it's not my point to pile on. My point is to help give us a biblical background and basis so that we know how to frame what marriage is supposed to look like. I mean, it is tragic. I mean, it's so nice to be able to stand up and watch two, a husband and a wife, man and a woman, with the gleam in their eye getting ready to commit themselves with the hope and the desire of what's in front of them together, only to find out that some of the tensions have proven so great. Maybe somebody walks away. Maybe they're just banging heads so much they just can't figure it out. And that grieves me. It really does. To watch the potential and then to see the end. And so vows are not a contract. You know, contract is if you do, then I will do. If you do this, then I will do this. You remember when those vows, that they're old traditional vows, but they're not just traditional words. Actually, it's hard to improve on the traditional vows. We're going to be committed to each other whether we're healthy or not. Whereas a contract could be, well, I'll be committed to you as long as you're healthy. I'll be committed to you as long as you're nice. I'll be committed to you as long as we have money. A covenant is something that says, I'm going to do this. And that last phrase is so important, so help me God. Because there are times where you might love each other, but you don't like each other. And so it is a covenant. And you young people that are being challenged and told, well, you know, it's just a piece of paper. Oh, absolutely not. Covenant is an unconditional promise. Marriage vows change things. They really do. You see, you go from being girlfriend and boyfriend to husband and wife. There is a transition that occurs there, I can tell you. You know, as I reflect back on our wedding, for a 30-minute wedding ceremony, things drastically changed from when we walked into the ceremony and when we walked out. I had now made commitments to leading our family before the Lord and living out my responsibility in this vow. And there was something that absolutely changed in that relationship. Some of you will be told, well, you know, you ought to just try living together. Another word is cohabit. Let's try that, you know. After all, you go out to test drive a car, right? You got a truck, you want to see if it's good. You get, for some of these places, you get 3 days. Bring it home, drive it around, see what you think. And so, you know, how about that? Would that really help in a marriage relationship? I mean, if we do it a little different than what God has prescribed, would that really work? Well, it's interesting. As I was going back and just looking on some of these statistics out at The Atlantic, that's a magazine and not a Christian magazine by any stretch of the imagination, they were saying that after a period of 5 years, those who had lived together before getting married, there was a much higher rate of divorce after 5 years than if they had not lived together. The marrieds, we understand and we see, stay together much longer and much greater than those who are just choosing to kind of cohabit, live together. Marrieds handle conflict different than those who just live together. If you're living together, it's like, man, I'm tired of you, just move out. Whereas in a marriage relationship, there's a much greater chance that individuals are going to go get some marriage counseling to figure it out, because you've really only got 3 options, right? One is to walk away, and most of the time it seems like that'll fix all of the problems, but it really gets messy. The other is to remain in the situation where you keep banging your heads, 2 ships passing in the night, and you're thinking, man, I don't know. The third option is, man, let's go get this thing fixed. I don't want to spend the rest of my life. And you need to understand that the vast majority, in fact, I don't know of any exception, the vast majority of marriage relationships go through difficult times. And so when you go through that, it doesn't mean that somehow you are unique, that somehow something has gone off the rails. It means welcome to marriage. You've got a man and you've got a woman. That's different enough. You come from different backgrounds. You come from so many different things. And now it's a process of taking that and, as God said, becoming one flesh. In fact, men, from what I have read, there's a much greater chance that a man will go to marriage counseling if they're married than if they're just living together. So home life is truly important. There's a married commitment. If you want a foundation for your home and for your kids, those of you who are contemplating, understand that what you're doing is making a commitment, a covenant before God about marriage relationship. The second area of vows, and I'm not going to spend nearly as much time here because we're just about out of time, is the area of dealing with those who, we're going to parent-child dedication. We realize our child is given to us from God. And so we want to bring our child and we want to dedicate our child. Well, really, in a sense, what you're doing is dedicating yourself. Because the vows you make about raising your child in a Christian home as a married couple who seeks before God to raise these kids and live it out, that's what makes the difference in their life. Just dedicating a child, yes, it's understanding they're a gift, but it's also realizing that we are making promises before God. And I'm so grateful for many within our own church family who understood that, who understand that, and so they're living out marriage and they also living out their parent-child vows. You see, marriage takes work. Plan your work and work your plan, as they say in the business world. And lastly, number fourth principle is that we have an offering to give to the Lord. Now you see that beginning in verse 24, though it's a little different than what Hannah has. Verse 24, now when she had weaned him, Samuel, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli, and she said, "Oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked for." So, verse 28, I have also dedicated him to the Lord as long as he lives, and he is dedicated to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. You see, there's a giving that's costly. Generosity. I'm going to take that which has been given to me and give back to the Lord. Giving is motivated by gratitude toward the Lord. I received this from you, so I give back. There's nothing that you and I have that hasn't been given to us. And so what we are doing is giving back to God something that he has already given to us. And then we close this morning because we say, well, what about us? What's our offering supposed to be? And I want to jump over to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And we read this, talking to those of us who are followers of Jesus. Because we don't come bringing offerings of flour, ephah of flour, and bulls and goats and those kinds of things. And so we are challenged, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. That's what we are to give to God, is us. And you see, if we are to have homes that are built on solid foundations, it starts with me. It starts with you. It starts with us as individuals, that we give ourselves to God as a living sacrifice. Notice it says bodies, which refers to the complete part of us. And so the most important thing that you and I can give to God is us. And that starts off, first of all, realizing that we're separated from God, and God doesn't owe us anything, and yet Jesus went to the cross to pay for our sins and our failures, invites us to be part of his family. And then when we trust Christ and put our faith and trust, God becomes our heavenly Father. And as a result of that, we begin our lives living for him. And whether it's at business or whether it's in school or whether it's at home, that we give to him us. That's foundational. And so I challenge you, parents, those of you who are involved in this process. Many of you have done this, but I continue to challenge you. What's the goal for your children or for your child? They're loaned to you by God. It's a stewardship that you have. So what is your goal for your child? And I would trust that those of us who know Jesus, that at the top of the list is a Christ follower, because it affects every single dimension of life. And so how do we do this? And then lastly, maybe for some of you, you're in a tough spot in your marriage. You're thinking, so what do I do? Let me ask you this. Give some thought to this. What is one thing that you can do? That you can do to make a difference? Not, well, if he does or if she does, if they do, if they do. What's one thing, just one thing, that you can do in your marriage relationship to make a difference? You see, what we learn here is the most effective and stable home is a place where lives are built on the person of Jesus. The most effective and stable home is where lives are built on Jesus. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this true story that has been revealed to us and recorded for us, even though we live a few thousand years later. Man and a woman who desired to live for you in spite of some mistakes, in spite of some errors, in spite of some missteps in their life, to come back and to walk with you. And Lord, I pray in a very special way for your blessing and your encouragement upon those in our church family, maybe young people looking at someday being married, to understand that these principles are super important as parents continue this conversation at home with their children to help prepare them for life. For those in the thick of the parenting process, Lord, for strength and encouragement as they jointly work together to make a follower of Jesus. For those who are going through struggles in a marriage relationship right now, Lord, even as Hannah prayed, that they can pray and ask for your wisdom and for your insight. Father, those who have been through the pain of divorce, that you would bring forth healing into their lives. That you're a God who is able to rejuvenate stuff that has happened in the past. And you can make us new and give us a new direction in life. And the most important thing is that we are those who offer ourselves to you. Here we are. And so it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for being here this morning. Go serve Christ as that living offering. You're dismissed.